This week's episode of the Wildcard Podcast is brought to you by last week's episode of the Wildcard Podcast.
Previously on the Wildcard Podcast.
And my co-pilots on this journey to wherever are my good friends, Jeff Curtis.
Hello.
And he puts the people in the people's temple. It's Ron Blair.
I do. I put them in the seats.
Oh, speaking of seats, do you know what puts our deckheads in the seats?
Iron Pants.
Close. It's Ron Blair telling what this podcast is all about.
What is this podcast all about? Well, I'll tell you.
The podcast adheres to a specific format. We always begin with a commercial and then introductions. Next, Ron tells us what the podcast is all about. Then it's time for the favorites question.
I guess if I could only choose one, I'd have to go with Thorwald Jorgensen.
It started out as favorites, like, what's your favorite chicken place? Things like that. But then it evolved into what if questions, or would you rather questions, that kind of stuff. It's a fun segment.
Jorgensen's good. Some say the best ever. But how do you choose just one good theremin player? It's not like asking, who's the best member of the Doors, or who's the best member of the Steve Miller Band. It's a tough question.
Could you repeat the question?
What do you think about the favorite section of the podcast?
Oh, it's great. Sometimes the questions are really hard, though, like, what's your favorite cheese? It's like picking your favorite child. Who can answer a question like that? Was that the right answer? It's probably smoked Gouda.
And on that note, friends, what starts with a question and ends in tears?
Marriage.
A Jaredisode.
Not my marriage, other people's.
Today's question is this. Then one of us does a report, which makes up the bulk of the podcast. Then it's a short wrap-up, and... And so I say to you, until next time, stay wild.
Stay wild.
And bite the edge.
And that's the show. I hit stop, I do some editing, I upload it to Dropbox, and then it's sent out live to our dozens of deckheads. Like magic.
It's magic heard world over each week. But is this where the magic begins and ends for our three dumb friends? Let's take a closer look at Jared Eaton, the Jack of Hearts, Jeff Curtis, the King of Clubs, and Ron Blair, the Ace of Spades, to see exactly what volatile environment has made this podcast magical. Jared, why don't you tell us how this whole thing got started?
How dare you accuse me of anything?
I didn't.
You don't know me.
Let's get to know you.
Let's.
Now, how did this whole thing get started?
I don't know. One day it just was. And we went from there.
But whose idea was it?
I believe it was.
Jeff, why don't you tell us how all of this got started?
All of what, my child?
The Wild Card Podcast.
Ah, the Wildcard Podcast never started.
I'm sorry?
The Wildcard Podcast always was. Can you remember a time when the Wildcard wasn't?
Yes, clearly. Prior to 2017.
And yet it was. The Wildcard is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and end of all things.
Now that's just crazy talk.
Or is it sane talk?
It isn't. So Ron, what happened?
With what?
This, the podcast, at the beginning.
Oh, I don't remember. We all just showed up and started talking every week.
But whose idea was it?
Ours.
The three of you?
Yeah.
Who came up with the format, and can you talk about...
Hold on. I had an idea. Yeah.
Let's talk about the sign-off. Who came up with...
And until next time, I say to you, stay wild.
Right.
Well, we knew we wanted to call it the Wild Card Podcast.
For obvious reasons.
Right.
I think it was Henry David Thoreau who said, "We need the tonic of wilderness. At the same time that we are earnest to explore and learn all things, we require that all things be mysterious and unexplorable, the land and sea be indefinitely wild, unsurveyed, and unfathomed by us. Because unfathomable, we can never have enough nature."
I don't ever know what the he's talking about.
And what about Bite the Edge? Who came up with that?
Due to legal reasons, we're unable to talk about Bite the Edge. There were some incidents in which certain parties made certain legal claims, and therefore all of us, especially Ron, are unable to engage in conversation about the tagline Bite the Edge.
I like nuns. They're sexy.
Speaking of nuns, how do you guys come up with topic ideas?
Oh, I like to use one of those spinny things that they have at the state fair when they give away prizes. I'll take my topic ideas, and I'll tape one on each of the spots, and I'll grab it, and I'll give it a spin like that, and I'll until it finally stops, and that's how I get it.
How do you come up with the topic?
Oh, the topic. Well, I go to the mall, and I kind of listen to people talking, and not what they're saying. I just listen for common key words like Shackleton, Hindenburg, Osage.
What about you, Jared?
I use a formula based upon ideas presented to me by the deckheads, topics assigned by the other guys, and various studies and events that have piqued my interest. I then choose a topic based upon certain lunar cycles and a carefully derived algorithm that considers current events, entertainment trends, and the alignment of the planets whenever we go live.
Ron?
Yes,
How do you come up with topic ideas?
I don't. I just show up and read the wiki.
How do you decide which wiki to read?
This week's episode of the Wild Card Podcast is brought to you by...
This week's episode of the Wild Card Podcast is brought to you by...
This week's episode of the Wild Card Podcast is brought to you by commercials. Commercials, it's what keeps the podcast going.
Who comes up with the idea of the commercials each week?
We were actually approached by our sponsors with the idea.
It was Lee's Chicken.
The Lee's Chicken people approached you?
Well, it may have been a guy named Lee who was selling chicken, but either way, we took his money and we've been sponsored by a different entity ever since.
Lee's Chicken, Breadfruit, Mr. Potato Head.
We don't say it often enough, but we're really honored to be sponsored by some really great companies.
The Rainy Day Contraceptive Sponge, Sesame Street's Dark Underbelly,
Great companies.
Rainbows and Kittens and Butterflies, Rainbows and Kittens and Butterflies Exterminators, the previous episode of the Wild Card Podcast.
Really great companies.
Friendship, Tesla,
Son of a bitch!
Sleepy Hollow Tourism, movies you've never seen, the entire Cave of Mystery series.
Really great companies.
La Vie Boheme, Cluckers, Me,
Really great companies.
and Gary?
How do the commercials get made?
Here you go, fellas. Here's a copy of this week's commercial.
It's 17 pages.
Am I playing Arbogast through the whole commercial?
People love Arbogast more than they love you.
I don't know that that's true. How many sound cues are in this?
As many as it took to tell the story, Jeff.
I don't know if it's necessary to have the clock ticking for so long.
Then you're not looking at the subtext, Jared.
Can't we cut it down? There's a whole scene set in a fertility clinic.
Yeah.
12 of the last 29 commercials have taken place in a fertility clinic.
I'm trying to tell a story here. It's an effing masterpiece.
I'm sorry. I don't like to swear.
No! No! Do you know what a hammer tapping a frog sounds like?
No! I've never tapped a frog with a hammer!
Well, it sounds like this. Ma, ma, ma.
I played that sound 5 minutes ago!
Can anybody help me make this commercial? Anybody!
He's doing the best he can.
You want a new commercial? That's fine. You want garbage? I'll give you garbage. This is bullshit. That's what it is. Done.
Let's do it!
This week's episode of the Wildcard Podcast is brought to you by the bullshit Ron has to put up with.
Are you, Ron?
As we wrap up this fascinating docudrama about these three fascinating men and their marginally successful podcast, the margin being against the nation's 10% of citizens who do not podcast, we have one more question that we'd like to ask. You guys are currently working on a very special 200th episode. Is there anything that you'd like to share with the deck heads before it airs?
I'd like to share my heart, my love. What we do requires love. Why do we teach? Out of love. Why do we entertain? Out of love.
I'd like to share with our deckheads this poem that was included in a letter that Herman Melville had written to Yoko Ono on his deathbed.
The greatest gifts we can give are the gift of knowledge and the gift of laughter. Most of the time, we give one of these to our listeners. Sometimes both. Rarely, neither. But when we don't give them knowledge or laughter, we give them droning and awkward silence, which is, in its own small way, a gift.
Standing o'er the cliff so high, the angels earned their wings. And though their time was coming nigh, the drum still drummed, the strings still singed. And then the scrawling, screeching came, to disturb sweet melody. And yet the angels still played on, despite attempted hegemony.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is, you're welcome.
The screeching grew, a din so poor 3 angels had forbidden. But Angel John, poor Angel John was smitten. He embraced the harpy, soaring away, leaving hand in hand. 3 angels were left alone. Yoko broke up the band. Thank you.
Is there anything that you'd like to tell the deck heads before the 200th episode?
No, I'm good.
Wildcard Podcast all about? Well, I'll tell you. Batman!
Batman! Batman!
There's only like 2 songs on Omnifest. The rest of that. You can be whatever you want to be.
I was going to go with Dung Beetle.
Oh, that's wrong.
The inside of my nose is really itchy.
You can itch. You can. And I'll do it in a Chicago accent when I do it. What is this badcast got about?
Fuck.
It's
Sorry, I had a burp just like stuck.
Doesn't
No,
sound like you.
it's
That
gonna
doesn't sound
come
like
out.
you.
Not at all. There it is. Put on your running shoes and come on down to Shoe Carnival.